All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Today we are starting Chapter 8, which was a bit of a stretch for one episode, but I think we'll be all right. I have 3 full pages of notes, but a good chunk of it is like a list, so maybe we'll be okay. I think we're going to get through all this in one episode, so let's get started and just get moving so we don't waste any time. Chapter 8. What's it called? It's called The Depression Begins. President Hoover Takes Command. And remember how at the end of Chapter 7, Rothbard ended with, well, the Depression's starting, so Hoover's ready to do his thing. Well, this is the chapter where we talk about how Hoover did his thing. And unfortunately, it didn't have good effects. Most of the programs that they tried to operate failed. They wasted a lot of money, they wasted a lot of real goods, real wealth, and generally they made things worse. And of course, it's worth noting that all of these policies were weaker or small, dumbed down versions of what came to be later in the New Deal. So, to start, Rothbard notes that Hoover's policy was high wage rates, public works, propping up unsound businesses. The New Deal, just a bit less so. He notes that he is personally a little bit surprised that the Secretary of the Treasury, I think Andrew Mellon, last name Mellon, I'm sure of that, opposes most of Hoover's things, says, no, let's be more hands-off than this. He gets completely overruled by the rest of Hoover's cabinet. And so we move on to the White House conferences. It's the first major section in the chapter, about a page in. So basically, Hoover called this giant conference between White House and prominent industrialists in November of 1929. Basically the idea was to bully them into maintaining their wage rates at a constant real level, and to continue to expand their investments, basically to continue to layer more malinvestment on existing malinvestments. It's worth noting that these aren't real investments because they're done at the behest of government. Because they're done at the behest of government, what the good, that is to say, the need or the want that they serve is the immediate want of the politician and not the future wants of actual people. Hoover called it coordination, but it wasn't really. It was really kind of that strong arm, velvet glove over the mailed fist kind of tactic. First day, the railroads, November 18th. Railroads made a bunch of promises about, keeping everything going, not lowering anybody's wages, keeping freight prices down, and they announced this publicly on November 19th, and later on they basically formed themselves into a formal organization or cartel. And we all know that cartels work great for making things better for the consumer. That's sarcasm. After that, there was probably the most important meeting on November 21st, where there were a lot of great industrial leaders. Henry Ford, Julius Rosenwald, Walter Teagle of Standard Oil, Matthew Sloan, Owen Young, Edward Grace, Alfred Sloan Jr., Pierre DuPont, William Butterworth. Basically, this day's meetings were about labor, and Hoover had the rhetorical trick of saying that, well, labor represents human homes. Hoover's kind of wheedling at these industrialists to tell them to keep those wage rates up. Basically, the plan is to avoid real wage rate decreases, to put the first hit of the depression onto the profits of these companies, which Rothbard notes is a bad idea because profits and losses tell you when you're doing the right thing or when you're doing the wrong thing. And if you deliberately tell businesses to avoid profits, they're going to not know whether what they're doing is doing the right thing or not. There was basically they wanted the companies to all maintain their current construction and expansion as they have been. Don't stop, buying a bunch of labor and goods to keep expanding your business, even though we know there's going to be a contraction soon. And also it was suggested to reduce the work week if necessary, which, as we discussed before, Rothbard notes is a really bad idea because it messes up the entire flow of how things work, and it spreads the pain out amongst everybody, both the productive and the less productive. Lots of problems with that. Of course, the industrialists, being kind of between a rock and a hard place, agreed. They had public opinion on one side, and they had the gun of government on the other side. And so they said, okay, well, we'll do this. We'll organize more. They arranged some further organizational work on December 5th. Telephone, steel, and automobile companies continued to expand their construction. And there was an executive committee formed for oversight so that people couldn't get away with, balking the orders of the cartel. On November 22nd, there was more conference. This time, they handled building and construction industries, kind of the same kind of deals. Keep expanding, keep your wage rates high, that kind of thing. On November 27th, they covered public utilities. On November 21st, Rothbard covers this a little bit out of order, and so it's out of order in my notes too, but I did notice that. November 21st, they covered labor leaders. This was easy. Basically, the labor leaders all agreed to what Hoover was saying, because this was exactly what they wanted. They wanted, more wages, or at least no lower wages, and they wanted wage floors, and they wanted to have all the things that they loved, and Hoover was ready to give all of them that on the silver platter. And the worst part is that even though they agreed to not ask for higher wage rates, they immediately betrayed this agreement on November 27th. On page 212 and 213 of this is the 5th edition, I think. William Green wrote the affiliated unions on November 27th, emphasizing that the agreement concluded with Hoover was not binding, and assuring his colleagues that they were free to press for higher wage rates in their negotiations. 1-2 punch. Just what we don't want. So Hoover justifies his action. He's like, this will prevent suffering. Right. It'll prevent suffering for the next 5 minutes, and then you're going to have your arm sawed off without anesthesia. It's fun to note that on page 213, there's a block quote by Hoover where he says, quote, "This is a far cry from the arbitrary and dog-eat-dog attitude of the business world from some 30 or 40 years ago." And, whenever you hear a politician say dog-eat-dog, you hear Ayn Rand roll over in her grave a couple of times. Really generate some electricity for that. The AFL, of course, was very pleased to get everything that they wanted and more, and to have the agreement be not binding so that they could just keep asking for higher and higher wages. After that, Rothbard goes into the inflation of credit, and the next section in the chapter is called Inflating Credit. In the first week of the crash, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve System threw $300 million into a bunch of shaky firms in the first week, in just 1 week. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot of money compared to today, but consider that, these dollars were worth like almost 100 times as much as they are today. So it's not, and government was a lot smaller to begin with as well. There was this massive pumping, which was basically directed toward the stock market. Because, obviously, if the stock market crashes, then what you do is you pump more money into the stock market, because that'll fix the problem. It won't just paper it over, and people will get a bunch of cheap money and do stupid things with it. So, to quote Rothbard, the weekly reporting member banks expanded their deposits during the fateful last week of October by $1.8 billion, a monetary expansion of nearly 10% in 1 week. Holy crap! To discuss that today, the current money supply is something like 30 trillion-ish, 20 to 30 trillion. This would be like spending $2 trillion or creating $2 trillion in 1 week. If you think that's not going to cause malinvestment in the economy, you've got another thing coming. So what they did was they also lowered the rediscount rate for existing debts. The stock market bounces, which, of course, you dumped a bunch of money into the thing, it's going to bounce. But at the same time, there's this massive controlled inflation by the Fed, which was actually overruled by the uncontrolled drops by the uncontrolled drops caused by regular people trying to friggin' do normal and reasonable things. If you remember back in chapter 4, part 1, Rothbard broke down the different methods by which you can inflate or deflate the economy and classified them as either controlled by the government or uncontrolled by the government or somewhere in between. Basically, the Fed is like spend, 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 and everybody else is like take, 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 take. So much so that all of the crazy Fed spending was actually, less than what people took out of the system. By December of 1929, the government was declaring victory. Mission accomplished, right? And of course, that's not actually how it went. Rothbard continues with the next section, Public Works, is a short one. November 23rd and 24th of 1929, there was a telegram and agreement to spend an additional $400 million on federal buildings to create and fund a division of public construction, plus another $175 million for various public works around the U.S. Yay, more inflation into things that people don't actually need. Consumption, 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 and never, never investment. After that, Rothbard talks about the New Deal Farm Program, which this is a fun one because it's basically oops, we screwed it up like 10 times in a row, getting worse and worse each time. So he starts out with kind of a historical perspective. Farm lobbying has been started out in the U.S. in about 1914. That's when farmers started to actually form lobbying groups for special privileges. The Department of Agriculture was started in 1914. In 1916 and beyond that, regulations were created to favor farmers over other consumers and producers in the U.S. economy. The War Finance Corporation and the Federal Farm Loan System were created. There was a Futures Trading Act that put prohibitive taxes of 20 cents per bushel on speculative, quote-unquote, speculative transactions in certain specific markets that are authorized by the Secretary of Agriculture, or except in certain specific markets authorized by the Secretary of Agriculture. Now, Rothbard doesn't show any data here, but this brought up an immediate question to me of like, well, gee, I wonder what happens if we look at, first off, were there any of these authorized markets where speculation could happen? And if so, can we compare them to the ones where it wasn't allowed and see what happens? The War Finance Corporation sunsetted in May 1920, but it was reactivated in January 1921, because there was another crash in 1920 through 1921. There was $1 billion of lending to farmers' co-ops and foreign importers. This was mostly finished by 1925, and most of the lending was to farm co-ops. We're going to find that farm co-ops get a lot of free money in this era. In fall of 1921, there was a 10% cut in freight imposed on like the railroad companies and other freight carriers. Between 1921 and 1922, there were a bunch of conferences and commissions to suggest more and more aid to farmers. Again, lobbying, rent-seeking. In 1922, there was something called the Capper-Volstead Co-op Marketing Act, which exempted co-ops from antitrust as long as they maintained a policy of having one vote per farmer. Now, antitrust laws are stupid to begin with, but creating antitrust laws and then exempting certain businesses from having to comply with them is just another problem layered on top of a problem. The solution is to get rid of antitrust entirely and let the market take care of it. But of course, the 1920s U.S. government was not up to that intelligent task. Thankfully, the Futures Trading Act was declared unconstitutional around the same time in 1922. But unfortunately, Congress basically was like, oh, that's unconstitutional? Okay, we're going to pass a similar, almost the same law again, and good luck with that. Good luck calling that one unconstitutional too. At least we'll buy some time. It was the Grain Futures Act. It was basically an end run, is what Rothbard calls it. In 1923, we had the Agricultural Credits Act, which established this vast federal farm credit system. Basically, lots of cheap loans to farmers, especially farm co-ops, and a lot of control over what they can do and where they can do it because of these loans. In 1920, the wheat and cotton growers attempted to cartelize. They attempted to form a cartel, and they failed. Basically, they couldn't hold the cartel together with just their own, internal pressure. No, they're going to need government to do that. Henry A. Wallace tried something similar with corn in 1921 and 1922. It failed in 21, but was partially successful in 22. He also, started calling these uncooperative independent farmers scabs, which is always nice. Calling them names, it's the kulak insult, basically. So after that, there was this thing called the Sapiro movement, which was basically attempted to collect wheat farmers together and have them organize into a cartel again. It started in July 1920, failed by 1922. In July 1920, there was a conference that encouraged more cartelization of farming in particular. They proposed cartels for fruit, dairy, vegetable, wool, cotton, tobacco. Those ones all failed. There was a livestock cartel that got put together. It kind of sort of worked. After that, they started making pushes for price controls. These plans culminated in what was called the McNary-Haugen Bills, which were vetoed by Coolidge, thankfully. But unfortunately, Coolidge tried the same things with cotton, so, whatever. On the plus side, price supports largely failed wherever they were tried in this 1920, 1922-ish time frame. Everybody calls Coolidge, Silent Cal, like he was all free market and all good, but Rothbard makes a point to note down all of these different interventions that Coolidge supported. For instance, there was the 1924 Norbeck-Burtness Bill, which created livestock loans, a livestock loan system. That failed. Coolidge initiated a commission or a conference instead, and then created the Capper-Haugen law, which failed. Coolidge kept trying to aid these farm co-ops over and over again. He basically, after all this stuff failed, he's like, okay, well, we're just going to create a new marketing division for co-ops specifically, and that'll be a nice little feather in their cap. When Hoover got into office, or when Hoover actually got some power, he also pushed, because he was Secretary of Commerce, I think. He was in the cabinet at the time. And so the farm price supports he supported via the Federal Farm Board in 1929. There was the Jardine Plan, which was a $500 million plan for loans for up to 20 years for farm co-ops, again, specifically. They set up stabilization corporations to control surpluses and prices. This was all in an attempt to control the price, control who sells what when. Again, it's a bunch more government control over the farming market, which is, of course, going to create distortions. The Federal Farm Board, of course, as you would expect, was filled with cronies, which is just another example of when you create these kind of government things, you get two things out of it. Number one, moral hazard. Number two, regulatory capture. It never works well, and yet they keep doing it over and over again. At this point in 1929, the Depression strikes, and now it's time to really get into the work here. And in farming, this was a complete catastrophe. Here's the pattern, all right? Number one, loan to farmers to hold back their crops. So give them money, they promise to hold their crops until later and sell them later. This is, of course, troubling because number one, it's creating credit expansion, and number two, not all crops can be held back successfully, and even the ones that you can hold back for some of, you lose a little bit here and there from spoilage. Step number two, there's this apparent short-term success. After all, they just paid a bunch of people money to not sell wheat, and so or whatever, and so the wheat price kind of inches up a little bit. Woo, great. And so farmers start planting more wheat, or whatever it is whatever the topic is that we're working on, so that they get paid more to not sell it, which increases the stores. As you can see, the stores are just going up and up and up and up, and they got to get used up sometime. And the government is just printing money and handing it to these people to hang on to it because the price right now is too low. So they keep the price artificially high, so they plant more to get more free money. It's not a great system. A lot of really bad incentives there. Step three, prices start falling again. This was either because of people who were just needed to sell, or oftentimes it was because of foreign markets also becoming better equipped to produce surplus, whatever material it is they're talking about, whatever farm product we're talking about. there's discussion about, let's see if we can find it real quick. Capper and McFadden. There's Wallace. I haven't been flipping pages. Give me just a second here. Yeah, encourage greater wheat production. Yeah, when they tried it with wheat, foreign countries such as Argentina and Russia increased their production and kept prices dropping. Prices went up a little and then went way back down. Well, the prices keep falling, and now all the stuff that people are storing is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The incentive to sell it as soon as possible is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Of course, what the government did then was they tried to limit the bleed by basically favoring co-ops. They're like, hey, co-ops, here's some more free stuff. Here's some more loans. Here's some more money. Here's some more this. Please don't sell this stuff. And then the government cries, overproduction, everyone's making too much whatever. And then finally, the stocks of held back stuff get sold, both by the farmers who are holding them back and by the Federal Farm Board, which had bought a lot of it. They basically bought it and put it in silos, and they're like, well, we'll hang on to it because we're the government. We can hang on to it. So the Federal Farm Board loses a ton of money selling this incredibly devalued, foodstuffs. And that makes the price drop even more, which makes everybody else want to sell even faster. They tried this. Rothbard gives details. I'm not going to go too much into the details because we're already pretty long here. But Rothbard gives extensive details of how the Federal Farm Board tried this strategy with wheat, cotton, wool, livestock, beans, pecans, citrus, etc., grapes, butter. The livestock attempt was nipped in the bud early on. The cartelization and the loaning collapsed early on, and thankfully, the livestock thing wasn't that damaging. But all these other ones, it was just a bunch of money that got dumped into farmers making the wrong things by the Federal Farm Board, and just this massive loss of wealth on everybody's hands. And of course, when people get this kind of situation, they will not necessarily the people, but some charlatans that want to get more power over people will start to come up with ideas for even stupider things. For instance, Rothbard notes that there was a movement for farm holidays, or like a return to barter economy, which basically led to a bunch of mob violence and then to penny sales which penny sales are, where a bankrupt farmer's friends strong arm everybody out of the auction, buy the farm for a penny, and give it back to the guy who dealt with it poorly. And so it kept good farms in the hands of bad farmers longer than otherwise they would have been. And of course, there's physical violence involved as well, so that makes it already a pretty bad thing. So that is Chapter 8. February of 1933, Governor Olson, under threat from radical farmers of his state to march on the Minnesota Capitol, decreed a halt to all foreclosures. It didn't help, but the government kept trying to make it help. The next chapter, Chapter 9, is just titled 1930, and so I guess we're going to delve deep into kind of the sunset time of the Hoover administration, because I think 1931 was his last year, right? Or maybe not. I guess this was 1929. 1930 is going to be Hoover's second year. 31 is going to be his third year, and FDR is going to get elected in 32 and start being president in 33. So we've still got quite a bit of Hoover time to hold on to. So I guess, hang on, we're going into Chapter 9 next time. After that, 1931, the tragic year, followed by the Hoover New Deal of 1932. Yeah, see, we're going about the way I expected. And then the close of the Hoover term, and that's actually the last chapter. So Rothbard doesn't actually handle... I expected Rothbard to hit FDR hard in this book, but I guess he's not gonna. It looks like the book ends with the end of Hoover's only term, as president. But we're going to keep slogging through. And of course, the FDR New Deal, I'm sure Rothbard has taken that apart elsewhere. So maybe we'll cover a little bit of that at some point. Anyway, Chapter 8, the Depression begins. The first year of Hoover's stupidity. We will cover Chapter 9 next week. Any sources or references in the book, I found as many of them as I possibly could, and I'm going to create a list of those on my blog. Yeah, this has been really, really interesting. This chapter was a little dense, but we just barely made it. So the repetition at the end was helpful because there's like 7 pages there of like, first they tried it in wheat, then they tried it in cotton, then they tried it. And if you want all the details, that I highly recommend going back and looking at the actual book itself, because Rothbard notes down a bunch of, names, dates, organizations, etc. But for the purposes of this summary, the routine and then what they tried the routine on several times, I think is probably sufficient. So yeah, there we go. We have finished Chapter 8. Chapter 9 is up next. We will get to that. We'll cover 1930. And as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And if you have any comments, I'd love to hear them. Send if you're still here, absolutely would love to have you subscribe, like, whatever. I don't, comments. It all helps this stuff get around. I expect this to be a niche set of videos, but what the heck. Anyway, thanks again. I really appreciate you watching, and I'll see you next time. Have a good week.